Have you ever asked yourself why the woman you love stopped looking at you the way she once did? You didn't click on this by accident. Something inside you shifted the moment you read that question. Maybe it was a memory. Maybe it was that weight you've been carrying in your chest for weeks, for months, maybe even for years. That weight that never seems to go away. No matter how hard you try to outrun it, no matter how often you go out, no matter how many times you tell yourself you've already moved on. The truth is, you haven't. And deep down, you already know it. You did everything you believed you were supposed to do. You were always there whenever she needed you. You replied before she even finished typing. You gave up time with your friends. You left your own goals unfinished. You sacrificed sleep. You sacrificed energy. You sacrificed pieces of yourself. And somewhere along the way, something broke. Something you can't quite explain. Something no one ever sits down and teaches you. Because it's much easier for people to pat you on the shoulder and say, "You'll find someone better." As if that actually answers the question that's been eating away at you. Because the real question was never whether you'll find someone better. The real question is, why? Why did the more you gave, the less you seemed to matter? Why did the harder you tried, the farther she pulled away? Why did the man who barely seemed to make an effort end up standing exactly where you thought you belonged? And here's the part nobody wants to say out loud. The part that goes against everything you were taught to believe. She didn't walk away because you treated her badly. In some ways, she walked away because you treated her too well. And I don't mean that kindness is a flaw. I mean something much deeper than that. Somewhere in the middle of everything, you quietly stopped being yourself. You became a reflection of who you believed she wanted you to be. And the moment you disappeared into that reflection, without even realizing it, you stopped being magnetic. You stopped feeling real. You stopped being someone with your own center. I know that hurts. I know part of you wants to reject it right now, to come up with a counter-argument. That's completely natural. No one wants to hear that part of their pain may have started with themselves. But if you're still here, if that opening question touched something real inside you, then a part of you already knows it's true. And over the next few minutes, we're going to unpack this slowly, honestly, without sugarcoating it and without pretending it doesn't hurt. This isn't a video full of pickup lines or clever tricks. I'm not here to give you scripts or shortcuts. What we're about to explore goes much deeper than that. We're going to talk about how attraction really works beneath the surface. And it's nothing like what you were taught growing up. We're going to uncover the hidden rules of desire, the ones no teacher, no parent, and no romantic movie ever bothered to explain. And we're going to talk about the one shift that can truly change your story. Not a new way to behave around women, but a new way to stand firmly in who you are. Stay with me, because what comes next might be the most honest thing you've heard in a long time. Let me show you something. Researchers once studied couples going through periods of emotional strain. Some participants were asked to remember moments when they had completely given in to their partner's wishes, setting aside their own needs entirely. Others were asked to recall times when they stood their ground, even if it created a little tension. The results surprised anyone who doesn't understand how the human mind really works. The partners of people who consistently gave in reported steadily lower relationship satisfaction over time. Not more warmth, not greater closeness, less. Constant self-sacrifice didn't create more gratitude or deeper love. It did the opposite. It drained attraction. It eliminated the sense of challenge. And in many cases, it quietly eroded respect. So how does giving more end up producing less? The answer lies in how our brains are wired to perceive value and desire. Deep within human biology is a mechanism shaped by millions of years of evolution. It's constantly and silently measuring the value of everything around us, not in terms of morality, but in terms of scarcity, how rare something is, how much effort it takes to obtain. When something comes easily, the brain automatically assigns it a lower value, not because it's actually inferior, but because so little effort was required to obtain it. When something demands effort, risk, or the genuine possibility of losing it, the brain labels it as precious, as something worth pursuing. That's not poetry. That's biology. That's dopamine. It's the same neural circuitry that makes a hard-earned achievement feel infinitely more satisfying than something simply handed to you. And that circuitry doesn't suddenly switch off in relationships. It operates exactly the same way. When you become the man who's always available, who never disagrees, who constantly rearranges his schedule, his priorities, and even his emotional state around someone else's needs, you're sending a message directly to the the other person's brain. And that message isn't, "I'm a good man who deserves love." The message is, "Nothing in my life matters more than you." Consciously, that may sound romantic, but the brain interprets it very differently. Psychologists describe something called the accessibility bias. When we perceive something as effortlessly available, our internal sense of its value naturally decreases, regardless of its actual quality. Not because the thing itself has changed, but because the signal we've received about how rare it is has changed. And rarity, that subtle feeling that something might not always be there, is one of the strongest forces driving human desire. This explains something you've probably seen happen. Maybe you've even watched it happen to someone you know. The man who never seemed to be trying too hard, who wasn't glued to his phone, who had his own life, his own goals, and his own passions, often attracted people in a way the man who gave everything simply couldn't. Not because he deserved it more, not because he was a better person, but because the way he carried himself communicated a completely different message. I have a life of my own, and that life stands on its own, with or without you. And this is where things become truly interesting, because none of this is really about surface-level chemistry. It's about identity. It's about who you are when no one is watching, when there's no audience to perform for. So let me ask you something that may sting a little. When was the last time you did something purely for yourself? Something that genuinely excited you, without wondering whether she'd approve, without filtering it through the relationship, without reshaping it to fit what you imagined she expected from you? If it takes you a while to answer that question, that tells you something. Psychology has a concept known as relational fusion. It happens when someone slowly, almost imperceptibly, begins to define their entire identity through the relationship they're in. Their hobbies begin revolving around their partner. Their plans always orbit the other person's plans. Every decision starts passing through the same filter. What will she think? How will she react? Will this upset her? Eventually, that person forgets who they are outside of that relationship. And when the relationship begins to fall apart or ends completely, something devastating happens. It's not just the relationship that's lost. It's the self, that hollow feeling. Not knowing who you are without the other person can be far more disorienting than the breakup itself. What's unsettling is that this process of losing yourself never feels like a loss while it's happening. It feels like love. It feels like devotion. It feels noble, even beautiful. Only later, sometimes years later, do you look back and realize how much of yourself quietly disappeared. No one forced you. No one demanded it. You gave it away willingly because somewhere along the way, you learned to believe that's what love was supposed to look like. But there's a profound difference between giving yourself to someone and losing yourself inside them. Real generosity comes from someone who already has a center, a foundation, a sense of self. Losing yourself comes from emptiness trying to fill itself through someone else's presence. And people, even if they can't explain why, feel that difference. They can't always put it into words, but they sense it in your energy, in the dynamic between you, in the difference between being with someone who's vanished into the relationship and someone who chooses to be present while remaining fully themselves. Right now, you may be thinking, that's easy to say from the outside. When you truly fall for someone, they naturally become the center of your world. And you're right, to a point. That feeling is natural. What's not inevitable is building your entire life around that feeling until it empties you out. That's a choice, usually an unconscious one, but a choice nonetheless. And this is where things become truly fascinating, because underneath that pattern isn't genuine generosity. There's something much deeper, something most people avoid looking at directly. Fear. The fear of not being enough. The fear that if you don't give absolutely everything, if you're not always available, if you don't constantly prove your worth, the other person will eventually realize you don't deserve to be there. That if they see your limits, your needs, your priorities, they'll leave. And here's the cruel irony. That fear doesn't protect the relationship. It accelerates the very outcome it's trying to prevent. Psychologist John Bowlby, who spent decades studying how human attachment develops from infancy, described what he called the attachment system. In simple terms, from childhood onward, we develop strategies for staying close to the people we see as our sources of safety. Those strategies are shaped by how our caregivers responded to us early in life, and once they're established, they often replay automatically in our adult relationships. People who grew up with inconsistent caregiving, sometimes receiving warmth, sometimes silence, with no predictable pattern, often develop what's known as anxious attachment. They learn that love is uncertain, that it can disappear without warning, so they become highly sensitive to even the the smallest signs of distance. They become experts at reading silence, at analyzing tiny changes in tone, at preparing for rejection before it even happens. And to manage that anxiety, they fall back on the strategy they know best. Give more, be more available, take up less space, become easier to keep around. The problem is that a strategy which once made sense in an unstable childhood often becomes destructive in adult relationships. It feeds the very cycle it's trying to escape, because the anxiety projected outward, the constant need for reassurance, the growing emotional dependence, becomes exactly the pressure that pushes the other person away. And when they pull back, even slightly, the anxious person sees it as confirmation of their greatest fear, so they hold on even tighter, which creates even more distance, and the cycle continues until it becomes exhausting for everyone involved. Recognizing this pattern in yourself isn't easy. It requires brutal honesty. It means sitting with a reflection that may not look the way you'd like it to, but seeing it clearly is the only real beginning, because until you recognize the pattern, you'll keep living the same story, just with different people. And there's something else that matters enormously. There is no trick, no shortcut, no clever technique, no collection of behaviors that can replace the work of truly knowing yourself. You can master the perfect text message. You can pretend to be unavailable. You can imitate the body language of confident people. But if, underneath it all, you're still driven by fear, still chasing approval, still convinced you're not enough exactly as you are, that emptiness will always reveal itself. People perceive far more than we often give them credit for. They may not be able to explain what they feel, but they feel it. Real self-worth, not the fragile kind built on repeating affirmations in front of a mirror, but the kind that comes from genuinely knowing yourself, from accepting both your strengths and your flaws. Doesn't require constant proof. It doesn't depend on external approval to remain standing. And that difference is visible. It shows in the way you speak, the way you carry yourself, the way you respond when life doesn't go according to plan, the way you occupy space. A man who truly knows who he is doesn't need someone else's love to validate his worth. He can want that love. He can cherish it deeply when it's there. He can grieve when it's gone, but he doesn't need it in order to function. He doesn't need it to believe his life has purpose or direction. And paradoxically, that freedom from needing is exactly what makes people feel drawn to him. Not as a strategy, but because it communicates something the brain naturally recognizes as valuable. This person has a life of his own. This person is at peace with himself. This person wants me because he chooses me, not because he needs me to survive. There's something important here that people misunderstand all the time. Talking about emotional independence, about having a life of your own, about not needing constant reassurance from someone else, does not mean becoming cold. It doesn't mean building walls. It doesn't mean pretending not to care when you care deeply. That shallow version of independence can be just as damaging as the opposite extreme. Real emotional independence isn't distance, it's groundedness. It's having a center of your own, a center that doesn't collapse because someone didn't respond the way you hope, a center that doesn't need another person to complete it because it already carries its own weight. And from that place, you can actually be vulnerable. You can open up. You can honestly express how you feel, without your honesty becoming a desperate plea for someone else to rescue you. There's a huge difference between saying, "I'm really into you and I'd love to keep getting to know you," from a place of genuine excitement and freedom, and saying those exact same words from a place of fear, from a place of "please don't leave," from a place of "I need you to make me feel okay about myself." On paper, the words are identical, but the energy behind them is completely different. And even though you can't see that energy, people feel it. Now let's talk about something that's rarely discussed in conversations like this. Boundaries. Not as a manipulation tactic, not as a way to seem harder to get, but as a genuine expression of who you are and what you respect about yourself. A healthy boundary isn't a threat, and it isn't an ultimatum. It's simply the natural line that marks where you end and another person begins. It's the quiet acknowledgement that your needs, your values, and your priorities are not automatically negotiable simply because someone else wants them to be. People without boundaries aren't more loving, they're more confusing. They create relationships with no structure, no mutual respect, and none of the healthy tension that allows relationships to remain balanced. And here's something many men don't want to hear, but it needs to be said. Every time you swallowed something that genuinely bothered you instead of speaking up, every time you smiled through something that was quietly hurting you, every time you gave in on something you didn't truly want just to avoid conflict, you weren't being kind. You were slowly building silent resentment, and over time, resentment poisons everything. At the same time, you were teaching the other person exactly how to treat you. People usually learn how to treat you not through some calculated decision, but through repetition. Human relationships naturally settle into patterns. If you consistently allow your needs to be ignored, that becomes the pattern. If your plans always come second, that becomes the pattern. Not because the other person is necessarily selfish, but because, in the absence of clear boundaries, every system naturally drifts toward whatever it's allowed to become. Setting boundaries isn't selfish. It's the foundation of any relationship built on honesty and long-term stability. It's the only way another person can truly know who they're with, and it's the only way the love you receive can actually be real, because that love is directed toward the real you, not toward a carefully edited version of yourself designed to meet someone else's expectations. I want to pause on one more idea because it connects directly to everything we've talked about. There's a belief so deeply woven into the way many men think about love that it's almost invisible. The belief that love is a transaction, that if you give enough, you'll receive enough in return, that if you're attentive enough, present enough, good enough, love will naturally follow as the reward. That belief makes perfect sense. It's how almost every other area of life works. Work hard, get results, study consistently, pass the exam, put in the effort, move forward. That logic works in many parts of life, but when it's applied mechanically to relationships, it often produces the exact opposite of what you're hoping for. Love, desire, attraction. None of them are rewards for good behavior. They're not grades handed out for effort. They're emotional experiences shaped by something far more complex. Perception, presence, someone's emotional history, chemistry, timing, and dozens of other factors that no one can fully control. Understanding this isn't a reason to give up on love. It's a reason to put down the impossible burden of believing that doing everything right guarantees a particular outcome, because that belief is exhausting. And it's also untrue. Love isn't manufactured, it's discovered. Once it appears, it can be nurtured, but it cannot be forced into existence. The only thing you truly control, the only real leverage you have, is becoming the most honest and fully developed version of yourself. Pursue goals that genuinely excite you. Invest in meaningful friendships. Take care of your body, your mind, your skills. Build an honest relationship with yourself. Learn to enjoy your own company, not as a strategy to attract someone, but because that's the only life truly worth living, whether someone is standing beside you or not. When you live from that place, the relationships that enter your life have a completely different quality, because you're relating from fullness, not from emptiness. You're no longer asking someone else to give you what you're missing inside yourself, and that changes everything. Now let me show you something fascinating from the perspective of neuroscience. Attraction is closely connected to a specific mental state researchers call the seeking system. This neural circuit, identified by neuroscientist Jaak Panksepp, becomes active during anticipation, when we sense that something meaningful might happen, when the outcome is uncertain but full of possibility. It's the mindset of the hunter before the hunt, not after. It's the mindset of the explorer standing before unfamiliar territory, when someone has a world of their own. When they have passions that naturally draw people in, when they aren't completely predictable, when the uncertainty surrounding their availability is simply a reflection of the life they already live. They activate that very seeking system in the minds of the people around them. They spark dopamine. They capture attention. They awaken the desire to know more, to get closer, to discover what's beneath the surface. On the other hand, complete predictability, constant availability, the certainty that someone will always be there no matter what, gradually shuts that system down. The brain stops seeking because it feels it has already obtained everything without effort. And once that seeking system goes quiet, boredom begins to take its place, not as a conscious decision, not as an act of betrayal, but as a neurological process unfolding far below conscious awareness. This doesn't mean you should pretend to be unpredictable or play games with your availability just to keep someone interested. That's a shallow, manipulative interpretation of something much deeper. What it really means is this: the fullest version of yourself, the one with his own life, his own passions, his own plans, his own boundaries, is naturally more attractive than the version that empties himself trying to fit into someone else's life. There's one more subject I want to touch on, something that's rarely discussed in conversations like this: how we deal with difficult emotions inside a relationship. Many men are raised to believe that showing emotion is a sign of weakness, so they bury what they feel. They suppress the fear, the anger, the jealousy, the insecurity. They choose the worst possible strategy, ignoring those emotions until they eventually explode, or allowing them to leak out indirectly through behaviors that quietly damage the relationship without either person fully understanding why. But there's another extreme that's just as harmful: having no emotional filter at all, reacting to every small frustration, turning every disagreement into a major crisis, expecting the other person to regulate emotions that you should be learning to manage yourself. The healthy path lies between those two extremes. It's what psychologists call emotional regulation, the ability to fully experience an emotion, to acknowledge it, not run away from it, and at the same time not let it consume you. To be able to say, what I'm feeling right now is difficult, and I can sit with it without letting it destroy me or the people around me. That ability has been described in different ways throughout centuries of Stoic philosophy, but it always returns to the same central truth: we can't control what happens to us. We can only control how we respond. It's one of the quietest and most powerful forms of attractiveness a person can possess, not simply because it looks impressive from the outside, although it does, but because it fundamentally changes the quality of every relationship. A man who can remain grounded while the storm is raging, who doesn't need someone else to regulate his emotional state, who can remain present during conflict without collapsing or shutting down, creates a sense of safety that very few people know how to provide. And that sense of safety is worth more than almost anything else you can offer. Now let me be completely honest with you. Everything we've talked about, anxious attachment, identity, boundaries, emotional regulation, real self-worth, none of it changes overnight. No video can fix it for you. No single book can cure it. Real transformation, the kind that reshapes the deepest patterns in how you relate to other people, takes time. It takes discomfort. It takes stumbling over the same obstacle more than once before you finally learn how to move past it. And above all, it requires something our culture doesn't value nearly enough: patience. Patience with yourself. The willingness to watch yourself repeat old mistakes without deciding that you're beyond saving. Because the mistake isn't the failure. The mistake is information. It's raw material you can learn from. There's a metaphor that stayed with me for years. A tree that grows in constant wind develops its roots differently from one raised in perfect shelter. The roots of a wind-beaten tree grow deeper. They spread wider. They become strong enough to keep the tree standing through harsh conditions. A tree that grows completely protected often lacks the root system needed to survive its first real storm. The work of truly knowing yourself, facing your fears, challenging old patterns, building boundaries where none existed before, that's what grows your roots. You can't see roots from the outside, but they're what determine whether you remain standing when the storm finally comes. And storms always come. Every relationship eventually faces moments of conflict, distance, uncertainty, doubt. The question was never whether those moments would arrive. The question is whether, when they do, your roots run deep enough to keep you standing, without desperately clinging to someone else as your only source of stability. And here's something that may sound surprising after everything we've discussed. Once you've done that work, once you've grown those roots, once you've built a life that truly belongs to you, the relationship you eventually build, if it comes, will feel completely different from anything you've experienced before. Not because you've learned to act differently, but because you've genuinely become different. Because what you'll bring into that relationship won't be an empty space waiting to be filled. It will be a full life that simply chooses to be shared. That difference is difficult to describe, but unmistakable in everyday life. Two people choosing each other from a place of wholeness, not because they need one another to survive, but because they enrich each other's lives, create a relationship with an entirely different quality. There's more lightness, more laughter, and a much greater ability to work through difficult moments without turning every challenge into a crisis. There's more freedom, and strangely enough, there's also more depth. I want to end with what I believe is the most important idea we've explored today. At some point in your life, someone handed you a story about who you were supposed to be in order to deserve love. Your parents passed it on, without intending to, through their own wounds. Your friends passed it on through their own insecurities. Movies reinforced it. Songs repeated it. Advertising sold it. An entire culture quietly shaped your expectations of what love should look like and who deserves to receive it. And that story, however well-intentioned, probably taught you that love has to be earned, that you have to prove yourself, that you have to be good enough, useful enough, important enough, indispensable enough for someone to choose to stay. That story is a lie, not because the world is perfectly fair, and not because love always finds the person who deserves it most. The world doesn't work that way. Pretending otherwise is naive. It's a lie because the assumption underneath it is false. Love isn't earned by making yourself indispensable to someone else. Love arrives when it arrives. It finds people who have enough clarity to recognize it, enough openness to receive it, and enough inner strength not to suffocate it the moment it appears. And that clarity, that openness, that strength, no one can give them to you. You build them yourself, slowly, through honesty, through the willingness to look directly at yourself instead of escaping into comfortable distractions, through the courage to ask, what's really beneath my fear? Who am I when no one is watching? What do I truly want from my life, beyond everyone else's expectations? Before we finish, I want to leave you with one question, not one to answer immediately, but one to carry with you over the coming days. Let it stay with you. Let it do its work. Here it is. Who would you be if you knew with absolute certainty that you are already enough, that you have nothing left to prove, that the love you deserve has nothing to do with how much you give or how available you make yourself, and everything to do with simply being fully yourself? Sit with that question, because the answer is very likely the most authentic and the most compelling version of yourself you will ever become. You made it to the end of this video, and that already tells me something about you. It tells me there's a part of you willing to listen to truths that aren't always comfortable, a part of you that genuinely wants to understand, not just react, a part of you that already knows something has to change, even if you don't yet know exactly what that change looks like. That's not the end of the journey. It's the beginning of a conversation with yourself, and that conversation is worth more than any relationship you'll ever have with another person. Because every relationship that enters your life, whether joyful or painful, will always pass through the filter of who you are when you're alone with yourself. And the work of building that person is the one responsibility no one else can carry for you. It's the only work truly worth beginning. If you made it all the way to the end, leave a comment saying, "I made it." I'll personally reply to you. And if this message resonated with you, subscribe to stay part of this journey. And if it meant something to you, don't forget to leave a like.